Khyber knives, punji traps, poison darts and tom-tom drums. We've got it all in today's video as we uncover the top 3 tribal warriors most feared by the Raj. So for this video, we're not going to look at established warrior groups like the Sikhs or the Gurkhas. We're really going to focus on tribal groups that were a consistent thorn in the side to the authorities and never fully accepted British rule. Therefore, we're going to count down in descending order. Number 3, the Kachins. Known to the Chinese as the head of the hills, Shantou, or the wild men, Yejian, the Kachins' tribal lands was in the northeast of Burma, near the Chinese border. The Kachins were skilled hunters and warriors. They fiercely protected their territory and were stubbornly independent. Divided into 5 principal tribes, the Kachins were armed with a variety of firearms brought from traders. This included everything from flintlock to converted Enfield rifles, and even some repeating carbine rifles. Crossbows made of bamboo, Kachin dars or knives, and spears were other common weapons. Arrows were rarely poisoned by the Kachin, and metal arrowheads were also uncommon. The Kachins preferred to attack at night just before the rise of the moon. This gave them the ability to fight in the half-light and have the moon to light them home. These swift, nighttime raids were their preference on the offensive, while defending Kachin warriors would generally fight behind village stockades against the British and often held their ground with great determination. The Kachins would sometimes build more complex earthworks and punji stick traps. Punji sticks were placed pointing upright at the bottom of a hole before being covered with material that would camouflage them. When a soldier broke through the flimsy cover over the hole, they would step on the spikes at the bottom and suffer serious injuries. Similar traps were encountered nearly 100 years later by US soldiers fighting in Vietnam. Number 2. Chin warriors from the Chin tribespeople. The Chin peoples lived in the mountains and hills of western Burma, bordering on neighbouring Assam in India. They were fiercely independent and they resented outside authority. Chin warriors were traditionally armed with flintlock muskets, dars or knives, and spears. Almost every free man owned a firearm, and every village made its own gunpowder. Some Chins, known as Chimboks, used poison arrows made by dipping arrowheads in decomposing fowl or birds. Chins fiercely defended their land and culture against external threats. The British encountered strong resistance from the Chin during their expansion into the region. Initially fighting the British from their village stockade strongholds, the Chin adapted their tactics to attack columns of troops, firing from secure positions and disappearing into the jungle. Chin warriors creeped up so close to their victims that when they discharged their weapons, the victims received powder burns to their bodies. British forces respected the Chins as guerrilla fighters who could more than hold their own and had a mastery of the jungle. A contemporary quote about the Chin people from the British India Intelligence Branch states, "The chief characteristics of the Chin are slow speech, avarice, distrust, thirst for revenge, impatience of control, and dirt." Known to stalk British columns for days, the Chins would wait for the ideal opportunity to strike. Like the Pathans of the northwest frontier, the Chins were experts at sneaking into military camps at night and assassinating sentries or stealing equipment under the noses of the British. Tin goods were particularly prized, so the metal could be melted down to make bullets. British intelligence officers at the time wrote, "Grey dawn was the Chin's favourite time for attacking a camp, and all columns had to be particularly alert in the early morning, at which hour we constantly lost men who had carelessly wandered outside the pickets." The Chin were also closely related to the Lushai or Mizo people, with many Mizos accepting Chin identity. A contemporary quote about the Lushai from the British India Intelligence Branch. "They were constantly a terror to their neighbours outside their own hills, as well as being frequently engaged in internal warfare." The medals associated with these peoples were the India General Service 1854 Chin Hill, Chin Lushai and Lushai clasps. And finally, number 1, the Pathans. Known at the time to the British and Indians as the Pathans, the Pathans are more accurately described as the Pashtuns. An old Indian proverb states that the Pathan is one moment a saint and the next a devil. Many of the Pathan tribes raided across the border into British territory, having done so for centuries before the British arrived, and consequently saw it as their right. The Pathan tribal code, known as Pashtunwali, readily gave rise to blood feuds between individuals, villages, and tribes. These feuds could last decades. A tribal gathering, known as a jirga, was the tribe's parliament, law court, and governing council. In the face of an external enemy, the Pathans would put their feuds to one side while the invader was resisted. Pathans mainly resided in fortified villages with attached stone towers serving as watchtowers and places of refuge in the event of an attack. Armed with a variety of weapons including Jazail firearms, swords and daggers, Pathans excelled at conducting ambushes and were proficient at close combat, making them formidable opponents. The main tribes of the Pathans were the Afridis, Masuds, Momans and the Wazirs, who were themselves divided up into clans known as Khels, led by Maliks. The medal collector will notice that many clasps have the name or a derivative of those various tribes. The Afridis were generally considered the wealthiest of the Pathan tribes, as the main trade artery of the Khyber Pass would go through their territory. The Afridis would extract tolls from passing caravans between India and Afghanistan under the threat of robbery or attack. The Masud Waziris were known as a particularly implacable enemy of the British, with multiple campaigns organised against them ranging well into the early 20th century. A British major serving in the northwest frontier in the early 20th century, a Major Walter James Cummings, states, "A good rifle to him, a Masud, is his most precious possession, much more so than his wife. His power of endurance is almost unbelievable, for he can cover 40 miles in a day without turning a hair." According to Frank Richards, a British soldier writing in the early 1900s, a modern British rifle that costs around £3 to manufacture could be sold for up to £24 if stolen and smuggled across the frontier into Afghanistan. With this money, a man could build a native house, buy a plot of land, have 3 or 4 wives and be comfortably well off. With this incentive, Pathans, being expert camp infiltrators, would smear themselves in leopard grease to dissuade guard dogs from approaching them and creep into soldiers' camps in an attempt to steal the prized rifles. Pathans were agile, swift and experienced mountain fighters. Pathan tactics would be to conceal themselves in the mountains and then ambush a British patrol, either through sniping or, if the patrol was deemed vulnerable enough, rushing and attempting to overwhelm the soldiers, engaging British soldiers closely with their Khyber knives and daggers. Any wounded soldiers captured by the Pathans, especially Sikh or British soldiers, were likely to be tortured and mutilated. Winston Churchill, who served out in the northwest frontier in the late 19th century, is quoted as saying, "It is a point of honour on the Indian frontier not to leave a wounded man behind. Death by inches and hideous mutilation are the invariable measure meted out to all who fall in battle into the hands of the Pashtun tribesmen." Pathan tribesmen were also capable of engaging in set-piece battles or engagements, such as at Umbela, where they would psych themselves up prior to each attack with tom-tom drums. The Pathans were most deadly when a force was withdrawing from an area. The British military even adjusted their standing operating procedure to ensure they could guard against it. Pickets, a small military post, usually on higher ground, were used to keep watch over an area and act as an early alarm system for the main force. These were particularly vulnerable to attacks from Pathans. Pickets on the frontier had to be reinforced with up to 15 soldiers per picket. British forces even developed a specific 4-phase withdrawing drill to prevent Pashtun warriors from overrunning slower troops or quickly capturing the higher ground as the picket left. There were close links between the inhabitants of the northwest frontier, who theoretically lived under British rule, and their kin living across the border in Afghanistan, which increased the tribal resentment over the existence of the border, an alien and incomprehensible concept. There are numerous clasps associated with fighting the Pathans, including the India General Service 54 Northwest Frontier clasp, Jawaki clasp, Samana 1891, and Hazara 1888 and 1891, to name but a few. For the India General Service Medal 1895, it is all the clasps, and various clasps from both the 1908 and the 1935 India General Service Medals. So in summary, in descending order, our most feared warriors were number 3, the Kachins, number 2, the Chins, and number 1, the Pathans. Thank you for watching. I hope you found some value from this. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.